I will present a few remarks on the rhetoric of religious war during the first part of the 1640s in England. Spiritual guidance of soldiers is the first of my two major themes that shed light on religious language used for purposes of war. The second theme, at least equally important, is the descriptions used for the legitimizing and dehumanizing effect, that is, creating otherness to distinguish the enemy from own military comrades. My claim is that both royalists and parliamentarians put considerable effort in using the weight of religious authority to influence their own soldiers, the enemy, and the general public. However, they had markedly different emphases on the audiences they targeted and rhetoric they used. Indeed, as I shall show later on, civil war battles were not only fought on the fields of the country, but also on the perceptions of the people, heavily influenced by the printing press. Thus, I stress the importance of printed pamphlets that were distributed widely for their own supporters, but also to those in doubt, as well as to the opponents. At the heart of the conflict was a civil struggle between Englishmen for the government of the realm and the souls of its inhabitants. This required narratives that explained the reasons and nature of the war to the common people, in addition to describing the enemy and its distinct qualities in detail. The importance of the English Revolution to European history, and especially to Anglo-American historiography, has ensured that the 1640s are thoroughly studied from multiple perspectives. One of those is the role of religion in the conflict. To put it simply, one approach distanced itself from the traditional interpretations that concentrate on the religiosity of Puritan soldiers and the New Model Army in particular. These scholars criticized earlier research for taking religious influence for granted and pointed out various other factors in explaining intensifying violence and motivation and conduct of armies. Another line of scholarship emphasized the religiosity of Puritan soldiers and effects of this religiosity in improving the army's performance and in shaping the conflict into more violent forms. Whereas militant Puritan faith has received the lion's share of scholarly attention, more recently an effort to investigate the royalist side has surfaced, arguing that military articles and orders regulated the cavalier's spiritual and moral upbringing in a very detailed manner, in certain cases such as swearing and blaspheming, even more so than parliamentary and military legislation. It has been claimed that supporting warfare by religious arguments was by no means an exclusive Puritan right, and the king's ministers' rhetoric against their enemies was not unlike parliamentary and militant preaching. My argument revises these suggestions with a comparative method. I think that it has its merits in this kind of study, dealing as it is with rhetoric and its propagation by the public press. The different uses of language are strongly dependent on the political and societal issues at hand and often developed in interaction with each other, shaped between polar opposites, as it were. This is not to say that the peculiarities of each of those opposites should not be examined. On the contrary, for it's precisely the comparative approach that makes those differences more visible and allows for their analyzing in detail. Thus, I emphasize that parliamentarian and royalist rhetoric was shaped by their interaction in political discourse. Their strategies of publicity control and target audiences were developed as reactions as much as catalysts to the events and actions of the other party. Hence, I deem it important to comprehensively compare religious rhetoric of both sides of the First Civil War to be able to point out the different emphases. This also explains my reliance to the printed sources, which had, due to their nature, a wider circulation than manuscripts. Okay, main part 1, religious instruction. Number 1 there. Both parliamentarian and royalist high command thought that the soldiers should be given spiritual advice and that ministers should be present in the armies to give sermons and oversee religious behavior. Moreover, many ministers on both sides wrote catechisms and prayer books for the soldiers' use. These aimed at reconciling Christian tenets with the violent profession of a soldier, but also contained war-related advice, justification of the armed conflict, and encouragement. Thus, these ministers provide excellent points of comparison in the different views on the place of religion in warfare. The distinct opinions are further highlighted in sermons given both to military personnel during operations and to politicians in London and Oxford, and later printed and published for even wider dissemination. Examination of printed pamphlets reveals yet another layer of study, that of target audiences. It is through these sources and these points of analysis that I will make my case of different opinions, emphases, rhetoric, and audiences between royalist ministers and parliamentarian preachers on the relation of war and religion. I concentrate on three main points. First, I look into concrete advice related to warfare, such as discipline, soldiers' qualities, and military strategies, arguing that parliamentarian preachers presented more practical counsel, whereas royalist ministers concentrated mostly on regulating morality. Second, I examine instruction relating to spiritual matters and guidance, as well as differences between religious practices such as praying, highlighting the dichotomy between passivity and activity. Last, I sum up these dissimilarities in two Christian archetypes that the ministers used as examples to the soldiers, the saint and the martyr, and the distinct interpretations of their nature. Number 1, instruction. Even though both parties provided a considerable number of pamphlets for instructional and propaganda use from early on, there were vast differences in content. I suggest the parliamentarian approach to war was more tangible. In other words, they were not only content at repeating what the Bible said about war, but they also carefully explained the applications of these passages. For instance, a parliamentarian minister, Richard Ward, described qualities such as obedience, experience, and courage that were required from soldiers. Moreover, he gave concrete advice to parliamentarian commanders, suggesting the devising of military stratagems to achieve victory. Ward was not an isolated case. Many other preachers and religious authors touched upon a soldier's profession in their advice. Some of these counselors portrayed surprising knowledge of military life, such as Donald Lupton, a former English army chaplain in the 30 Years' War, who expertly discussed the latest military strategies and technologies and commended the musket over any other weapon in contemporary warfare. Another army chaplain, Robert Ram, emphasized the preferred attributes of a soldier, for instance, experience, skill, and dexterity, and justified the use of tactical cunning, encouraging his audience to read instructional military manuals for educational purposes. Other Puritan authors, such as John Price, Edward Rayner, and William Beach, highlighted concrete matters of warfare. In their opinion, Christianity was not a hindrance to military action, but rather on the contrary. According to them, God was a man of war, and his people should be instructed in military expertise. Discipline was one of the foremost qualities in an army, and its importance was stressed by parliamentary and clerical authorities. Obedience to officers was reinforced with religious arguments. Hierarchy in the army was divinely ordained, and violating it led to punishment by both military law and God's decree. Thus, the authority of the Bible strengthened military articles. However, preaching for unquestioned obedience to army commanders and against submission to the king at the same time appeared contradictory. Puritans thus developed a very intimate connection to the Lord of Hosts and imagined themselves as his tools, fulfilling his plans in the world. This sanctified the armed uprising while ensuring that the proper chain of command was respected. The sign that they were in the right was the success on the battlefield, for God showed his favor by blessing the armies of his chosen people. Hence, giving attention to military issues in religious publication was the work of the Lord. He had taught the biblical Israelites to fight, and this martial education was seen as necessary in these later times too. By contrast, loyal ministers of Charles I had markedly different attitudes towards the role of religion in warfare. It was not that they did not support their sovereign and his prerogatives. They absolutely did, and there was no doubt in their minds that the king had the right to put down a rebellion with arms if necessary. What they criticized was the use of the Bible to foment sedition and to inspire men to fight. Christianity was a religion of peace, they claimed, and should not be used to arguments for oppressed and war. The foremost of those royalist ministers who sought both to educate the king's armies and engage the parliamentarians with their publications were Charles chaplains Edward Simmons, Arne Fern, and Thomas Swadlin. They criticized Puritan martial preaching and thus could not offer too much warlike instruction to the cavalier soldiers at the same time. Instead, the king's ministers emphasized Christian warfare. For them, this meant that the loyalist soldiers should be spiritually and morally educated. The royalists were preached on their sins, especially swearing, and reminded that a true Christian soldier was merciful to his enemies, refrained from cruelty, and did not harm civilians. Moreover, they attempted to reform the enemy armies as well. Astonishingly, they did it in sermons and instructional publications that were supposed to target the king's own soldiers. While advising royalists to avoid sin and cruelty, they also told that rebellion against God's chosen monarch was a grave iniquity that was harshly punished in this life and the next. However, ministers promised that the rebels were not doomed. In fact, all they had to do was to drop their weapons, repent, and return to the king's good graces in exchange for mercy and pardon. A good example was Swadlin's Soldier's Catechism for the king's armies. It did not mention obedience to commanders nor the importance of discipline at all. Instead, it emphasized loyalty to the king. Moreover, it did it from the viewpoint of a repentant Puritan who sought advice to renounce his oath of obedience to Parliament. Another example was Simon's military sermon preached to Prince Rupert's army. The first 10 pages of the published sermon explained why the rebellion against the lawful sovereign was wrong, which seems strange manner of instructing and encouraging own soldiers. Thus, it can be concluded that both sides took pains to instruct their armies with the prestige of religious authority. In parliamentarian armies, this education was strictly for the Puritan soldiers' use, and it often dealt with concrete issues the men were facing during the campaigns. In royal armies, on the contrary, the advice was more of a moral and spiritual nature, and tangible counsel for war stayed in the margins. Moreover, royalist ministers also targeted parliamentarians in their publications, trying to make them see their error and return to the fold. And the second point, spiritual matters, or education. When it dawned that the war was not going to be over soon, there emerged more forcefully the claim that the conflict was due to God's wrath against England for the sins of the people. Moreover, these spiritual infractions had a negative effect on the success of the armies. God blessed only the soldiers who avoided sin, and those who succumbed to drunkenness, blaspheming, disturbing civilians, and other offenses drew the Lord's displeasure over themselves and their cause. Therefore, the military chaplains had to educate the men in moral matters. While parliamentarians and royalists were in agreement that sins should be weeded out in armies, they approached the solution to the problem from different perspectives. The latter often concentrate on their own sins in a very submissive way. All the misfortune the king's party had drawn upon themselves was dispelled only by praying God for forgiveness. To this end, royalist ministers published numerous praying manuals to the armies. The multitude of supplication contained in these manuals was only rarely relevant to the soldiers' profession. They mostly concentrated on the well-being of the royal family and swearing and blaspheming, the favorite iniquity of the royalist party. Indeed, the cavaliers' vulgar language received as much attention as all the other sins combined, and proclamations and even a sermon were published to combat this widely spread practice. Since parliamentarian propaganda used an archetype of a swearing cavalier to discredit those fighting for the king, it is apparent that the habit, even if exaggerated, was a publicity problem. Moreover, it created distinction. Pious parliamentarian soldiers could feel moral superiority as well as camaraderie in their righteousness. However, their preachers did not tolerate sins any better than their royalist counterparts and preached against both moral infractions and also sins of more tangible nature, like cheating the soldiers of their pay. It can be argued that addressing this kind of problem was more beneficial to the armies than concentrating extensively on the words the soldiers used. Even parliamentarians still acknowledge the detrimental effects of sins on their military pursuits, especially when faced with losses on the battlefield. Whereas royalist habit was praying God for forgiveness, Puritans portrayed more active method of solving the problem. Many sermons addressed defeats suffered by Parliament's armies, and the message was the same: not enough had been done to achieve victory. Sins certainly had their part to play, but even then the agents of change were the soldiers themselves. It was not enough to only pray, one had to work towards the desired effects of praying. This was the proper way to reverse losses, preachers claimed. Another significant difference between royalists and parliamentarians was that there were hardly any pre-formulated prayers in Puritan publications. They told to pray and they gave the reasons why. The benefits and effects of praying were spelled out in a clear manner, such as encouragement, comfort and unity of the righteous. These were detailed in the instructional pamphlets for the soldiers, but only rarely was a complete prayer included. It was more important for the preachers to teach why praying was crucial and how it should be done, i.e. completed with action, not only passive supplication. Royalists, for their part, published numerous prayers to be used by the king's soldiers. As mentioned, only few of these were related to war or military vocation. Most of those that touched upon the conflict were thanksgivings, but few others often asked the Lord to bring peace to the enemy's hearts. This leads us into another interesting feature of the royalist clergy. In the published pamphlets, they portrayed very moderate and conciliatory attitude towards the enemy. Indeed, parliamentarians were seen as a punishing scourge of God's wrath, and loyal ministers insisted that it was necessary to endure their deserved chastisement, after which it was hoped that the rebels would put down their weapons and be reconciliated with their sovereign. This notion of the enemy as God's tool of punishment for the royalist sins was a peculiar idea to include in the instructional material. Admittedly, so is the habit of teaching prayers for the enemies to come to their senses and seek peace, instead of praying for strength or courage to win battles, for example. These choices speak volumes about the content of religious instruction in royalist armies. There were doubtless propaganda considerations, but also sincere Christian beliefs behind this chosen line of approach. Of the few ready-made prayers available to Puritan soldiers, none was for the enemy. Moreover, royalists were not generally seen as the rod of God's wrath upon sinners. Quite the opposite. A pamphleteer, John Price, for example, emphasized that if God was angry, he was angry to the royalists, and it was actually the sacred duty of parliamentarian soldiers to punish the wicked for their transgressions. God's wrath was upon England, but that was because of the sins of the enemy. Salvation was only possible through holy violence. I will return to this important topic later on, but next I will turn to religious ideals that the ministers used. And that is number 3, saints and martyrs. These different religious views and notions were crystallized into exemplary models that the ministers used as an example to the soldiers, the martyr and the saint. The former role, that of the martyr, was brought forward as a justification of 2 arguments royalist ministers proposed, one against parliamentarians and one addressing their own party. The first criticized Parliament's resistance and stressed that the only lawful way to oppose a sovereign was the martyr's way, by suffering and dying. The second point they made was that those who fought and died for Charles were to be rewarded with a martyr's laurels. This honorary nomination was passive except in praying and submitted to God's displeasure without complaint. Suffering and dying were emphasized, resembling the early Christian martyrs who had endured cruel deaths for their faith. The martyr's characteristics stayed the same in both applications. It was passive in resisting a tyrant and was not more active when fighting against the rebels. Again, this interpretation can partly be seen as a criticism of parliamentarian more active idea and as an attempt to reclaim the notion of martyrdom to its ancient use. Indeed, Puritans such as Stephen Marshall and John Goodwin presented totally different opinions on martyrdom. According to them, martyrs were those who resisted the wicked and perished in their act of rightful defiance. A politician and soldier, one Edward Leaf, even stated that only dying for a right cause was not true martyrdom. There had to be will and intention to pursue the cause even at the cost of one's life. Thus, there was an active component that was lacking in royalist interpretation. More often, Puritans used the saint as a Christian paragon. A saint was God's chosen soldier who portrayed strong religiosity, which manifested itself in avoiding sin and the company of wicked men, as well as in temperance, courage, and shared brotherhood of the righteous. Moreover, it was vocally expressed that the saints should be actively pursuing the desired end. It was far more important to think what they shall do for God than to think what they shall receive from Him. This attitude, together with the eschatological notions of Christ and His army of saints fighting against the devil and his wicked subjects, lent itself to the soldier's instruction better than a passive ideal of the martyr. A saint was also a revolutionary. Rising against a sovereign was not easily justified in the 17th century, especially without a lawful pretender to support. Thus, the uprising had to be credibly legitimized. It was done by careful argumentation in realms of law and theology, but there also emerged more radical interpretations. These claimed that God was a man of war, as were his saints. Thus, not only was war lawful, it was also a religious obligation. It was the duty of the saints to punish the malignants and even execute judgment upon kings and nobles. God's command was the ultimate justification that the Puritan preachers propagated. The saints enjoyed almost direct communication with the Lord, only the preachers were in between to convey His will. This bypassed the king as well as his bishops and hierarchy of the Church of England. Thus, in the characters of a saint and a martyr, many notions were crystallized, according to which the different sides pursued the war. They were religiously constructed identities with whom the ministers wanted to associate their soldiers. Moreover, they were points in a public debate around which interpretational battles took place. For the royalists, it was important to emphasize the passive resistance of the Christian martyrs of old to frame parliamentarian resistance as unlawful rebellion. Puritans, for their part, highlighted vigorous activity of God's chosen people to achieve desired results and justified their actions by God's will upon His saints. And then main part 2, religious dehumanization. If religious instruction was one side of the coin, the other was religious dehumanization. Its idea was to present the enemy as something else and especially something less than a fellow Englishman. Indeed, in the Civil War, soldiers could find friends and relatives fighting on the opposite side. Somehow this closeness and familiarity had to be torn apart. There were many ways to achieve this, but religion was the most prominent. By dehumanization, I mean rhetoric that described the enemy as wicked, evil, and far from a good Protestant. Obviously, the word dehumanization did not appear in 17th century English, but I justify my use of it by the understanding of the concept of othering the enemy by violent rhetoric that the English Civil War participants certainly had, because they commented and criticized their practice. There are three crucial elements arguments that I am making. The first is the importance of the Irish rebellion to the wider delegitimizing rhetoric during the Civil War. Second, the biblical violence was appropriated by the Puritan ministers as a means to resolve the conflict through bloody judgment on the malignants. It was no longer enough to win the war, but those deemed culpable of the conflict had to be punished harshly. Innocent blood had to be washed away by the blood of the guilty. Third, royalist ministers in general refrained from dehumanizing their enemies. Even when they sometimes used names that were delegitimizing, these were uttered as insults and they were toned down by compromise-seeking moderate overtures. Their strategy was to offer peace to the enemy, not preach uncompromising war for their own soldiers. And the first point, the Irish and Catholics. Relations between the English and the Irish were uneasy in the beginning of the 1640s. Thus, when the uprising against the Protestant settlers and the English rule in Ireland began in October 1641, it did not take long that the London press started to publish news and commentaries on the event, written with language that reflected not only the actual atrocities that had happened, but also the deep mistrust and hostility that had been already felt towards the Irish Catholics. This animosity was all too often draped in the guise of religious distinctions. And here's some examples of the rhetoric that the London press used. The rift that the Reformation had created was far from overcome in the British Isles. The English saw the Catholic Irish as the agents of the Pope, only waiting to rise up, drive away the Protestants in Ireland, and assault England itself. The rebellion seemed to confirm these fears. It was not only an attack against the king, who, in the English perspective, lawfully ruled Ireland. It was also an attack against the Protestant religion by the forces of Antichrist. Hence, the Irish were portrayed as inhuman barbarians who were instigated and directed in their rebellion by Jesuits, priests, and the devil himself. It is crucial that the hardline Puritans, who later sided with Parliament, condemned the rebellion very quickly and strongly. The king, however, was both less speedy and less severe with his words against the Irish. Moreover, Charles was hesitant to blame the religion of his Irish subjects, but concentrated rather on their apparent disloyalty, whereas Puritans attacked Catholicism as the key catalyst of the rebellion. This discrepancy deepened the distrust between the king and parliamentarians and was an important factor that shaped dehumanization in England when the Civil War began. The Puritan narrative was that the Papists were let loose to destroy all the Protestants in Ireland. The anti-Christian rebels were a danger to the true Protestant religion, it was claimed, and preachers demanded a violent solution to the uprising. Thus, while atrocities against the Protestants in Ireland were circulated, enlarged, and propagated by the public press, the harsh reprisals of the English and Scottish soldiers were celebrated. As stated, the king was more moderate in his proclamations, refraining from highlighting the role of Catholic faith in the uprising. Resembling the later royalist overtures to parliamentarians, he condemned the rebellion and warned of the consequences unless the rebels put down their weapons and repented. This was nothing like the Puritan rhetoric that demanded that bloody, barbarous Irish rebels, wicked, savage, inhuman vipers, and anti-Christian sons of Belial were to be killed without mercy. When the political situation worsened in England, Papists started to be found in the emerging Royalist party. Early on, parliamentarian authors created a connection between the Irish rebels and the English loyalists, and since this connection could not be ethnic, it had to be religious. Therefore, Puritan polemicists published pamphlets that blamed Popish cavaliers for atrocious attacks on Protestant civilians and claimed that bishops and other wicked clergymen were plotting to subvert Protestant religion. They suspected that Charles had been seduced or at least deceived by his Jesuitical advisors and explicitly claimed that King's followers were equally merciless as the Irish. Royalists were not only criticized for their conduct, they were also attacked by allegations of Catholicism. There were some grounds for the accusations. The Catholics, persecuted by penal laws against their faith, were obviously mostly supporting the king, whose tolerance towards Catholicism extended to his private life, having married Henriette Marie, the Catholic daughter of Henri IV de France. Hence, in many a calculation, the victory for Charles in the emerging conflict was seen as a better alternative to those of Roman faith than the prevailing of Puritan parliamentarians. In anti-Catholic English society, Parliament thus emerged as the champion of the true Reformed faith and the bulwark against Popish plots and Jesuit conspiracies. Puritans used this influence to attack various groups with accusations of papism, even those that had nothing to do with Catholic religion. The king's armies were said to contain not only English Catholics but Irish rebels and other foreign papists as well, who allegedly terrorized the good Protestants and sought to replace the true religion with Popish idolatry. These narratives presented in sermons and parliamentarian declarations were repeated to Puritan soldiers in instructional pamphlets. Thus, Catholic faith remained an important accusation that was very liberally used to describe enemies who were not necessarily Catholic at all. Religion was a major justifying factor for dehumanization, as well as a means to create otherness crucial to the process. Moreover, in parliamentarian case, it elevated the conflict to a transcendental level, where earthly allegiances and codes of conduct could be forsaken by the command of God, whose cause and glory was at stake. I argue that this led to religiously sanctified violence, where blood had to answer for blood. And the second main point, blood guilt. As we have seen, parliamentarian preachers projected negatively perceived ethnic and religious qualities to their royalist enemies, thus creating an all-encompassing group of others who could be blamed for all the troubles in England, and especially the war. As it went on, the calls for punishment of the guilty started to be more vocal among the preachers. Blood of the guilty was demanded in compensation for innocent blood that had been shed. This was the only way to appease God's wrath. Attitudes had hardened, shown by direct requests to the politicians. In many a sermon, it was advised not to make peace with the royalists because it would make God angrier. A false peace with the malignants was a sin that demanded punishment. In addition, an unsteady pact would not be a lasting settlement. The only solution to the conflict was revenge on those that had caused it. The tools and executors of this religious task were parliamentarian soldiers. This transcended simple dehumanization. In addition to othering the enemy with scriptural terms, a religious duty to kill them was established. Mentions of this violent task were presented very early by parliamentarian preachers. Perhaps not surprisingly, it was first applied against the Irish. For instance, Stephen Marshall invoked blood guilt in an attempt to galvanize Parliament into action against the uprising. The work was to spill the blood of men, women, and children, and those refusing this duty or doing it negligently were cursed. The same message started to be more common in England in 1643, when the military situation did not look too promising for Parliament. Ministers let their audience know that blood had been spilled, and making up for that would cost even more blood. Especially after the Solemn League and Covenant, Parliament's alliance with the Scottish Covenanters, sermons began more often to feature demands for executing justice. The uncompromising passages from the Bible were not interpreted more leniently but unleashed in their full force to Parliament and to Puritan soldiers whose responsibility it was to carry out the punishment. Preachers stated that the godly soldiers carried the sword of justice to execute revenge on the enemy. And here are again some examples. Army preachers such as Robert Ram conveyed this doctrine to the armies. Ram stated that executing justice was both civic duty and God's command, and specified that it were the soldiers who carried this task on their shoulders. This sanctified the violent actions of parliamentarian soldiers against royalists, but it also brought them responsibility and power that could be used for political purposes. The Christian Soldiers magazine, a spiritual manual for parliamentarian soldiers, included a rare pre-compiled prayer for Puritan soldiers. As a sharply contrasting example to moderate and peace-seeking royalist prayers, this supplication repeated the verse about shedding blood and asked that the praying soldier would be the executioner of this most just and righteous decree. Thus, it was made clear to parliamentarian soldiers what was expected of them. While soldiers were taught how to punish the wrongdoers, politicians were told not to make peace that made any compromises with God's honor. That is, not until the Lord's quarrel with England had ended could a lasting peace be attained. Thus, preachers gave sermons that spoke against peace, warning that a false settlement with the enemy would only lead to harsher divine judgments in the future. Punishment of the guilty had to come before any peace, and a parliamentary and military victory was necessary to ensure the right order of events. Some Puritan ministers appeared horrified by God's severe demand, but they claimed they had no alternative but to preach for it. To sum it up, many Puritans saw the conflict as a trial that had to be overcome on England's way to conclude the Reformation. The Royalists were proclaimed as the devil's army and sinners who had drawn God's wrath upon England. They were to be fought against as enemies but also killed as a necessary sacrifice before the conflict could be ended. Like biblical Phinehas, who had slain a fellow Israelite in his zeal and thus stayed the plague God had sent to punish them for their idolatry, parliamentarian soldiers were exhorted to do their part in washing the nation's sins away with blood. And then point 3, the Royalists. As I have suggested, royalist religious instruction to the king's soldiers had more to do with their Christian moral and standards of conduct than with guiding them to be better soldiers and win battles. This was also true when they wrote about the enemy. There were certainly no hesitation to judge parliamentarian rebellion. It was both unlawful and ungodly, and those participating in it had sinned gravely. However, despite this, the loyal ministers asked soldiers to be merciful and refrain from cruelty. Unlike their Puritan counterparts, royalist clergy did not see the conflict as an eschatological war of the end times, nor as a battle between God and the devil. Their religious interpretation was that God was angry for the sins of the English. The remedy was, as we have seen, praying for forgiveness. Hence, they certainly did not suggest cleaning sins away with blood. Indeed, the king's ministers openly criticized parliamentarian preaching for war and their dehumanizing rhetoric, and here are again some examples. It is mostly through royalist texts that we see the notion that legitimizing the enemy with violent language could lead to a more ferocious spiral towards massacres and atrocities. Moreover, ministers suggested that harsh rhetoric of the Puritans was contagious and caused royalist soldiers to act alike. The terms Roundhead and Cavalier, used pejoratively during the Civil War, were presented as examples of verbal abuse that had driven hostilities towards crueler atrocities. Several loyalist ministers complained in print how Puritan preachers used religion to justify rebellion and violence. According to them, priests of Mars interpreted the Bible completely wrong and moreover had not understood the minister's role at all. It was to preach for peace. Warlike preaching was authorized only by the permission of the rightful authority, the king. However, the same ministers gave sermons to Oxford Parliament in which they advised against peace that compromised the king's prerogative and the established church. Thus, it is clear that they were not pacifists and did not condemn war altogether. Neither, however, did they contribute to the king's war effort with the same single-minded zeal that their Puritan counterparts. Rather than exhorting the Cavalier soldiers, they chose to address the enemy, warning them of their serious mistake of rising against the sovereign, reminding them of their proper duties of a Christian subject, and offering them mercy in exchange for repentance. This was a chosen strategy, no doubt, but it ensured that the royalist ministers could not use the same methods of religious instigation and dehumanization the parliamentarians. A single exception is worth mentioning, namely Bishop Griffith Williams, who was not unlike the Puritans in his fiery rhetoric, condemning parliamentarians to hell and suggesting that the rebels should be killed without pity or mercy. However, Williams remains an anomaly among the royal ministers, and his pamphlets, delegitimizing as they were not published for the king's soldiers' use. Thus, publications for royalist soldiers did not exhort to violence and certainly did not make killing a religious duty. In many cases, it was rather on the contrary. Henry Fern advised soldiers to be moderate in victory and refrain from slaughter and cruelty. Thomas Swadlin mainly addressed parliamentarians in his soldiers' catechism, and the meager advice he gave to the royalists was conciliatory, telling them to spare surrendering enemies. Edward Simmons, in his sermon to Prince Rupert's army, declared the enemy to be a generation of vipers and devil's children, and accusing them of that most heinous sin, rebellion. However, he then expressly told that despite parliamentarians inviting a severe punishment, he would not stir the soldiers up to be cruel and could never instigate them to bloodshed. Indeed, the Cavaliers were explicitly told to refrain from cruelty and to show mercy. A last, very illustrative example of these differences is Swadlin's satirical version of Ram's Soldier's Catechism. Both this and Swadlin's Catechism for the King's Soldiers were born as a reaction to the success of Ram's original pamphlet that saw multiple editions and was apparently very influential among parliamentarian armies. In the satirical version, Swadlin ridiculed parliamentarians and tried to make them see the error of their ways. Since he had retained all the original questions of parliamentarian catechism, Swadlin's pamphlet was a good example of the royalist manner of toning down the rhetoric. His version of Ram's most bloodthirsty passage added conditionals, explaining that even though parliamentarians should not be pitied or spared, the king's soldiers were prone to do good instead of evil and offered peace to the enemy. Thus, royalist ministers chose totally different way to instruct and influence their soldiers. In fact, they attempted on many occasions to influence the enemy soldiers instead of their own. This approach necessitated moderate, restraining language vis-à-vis dehumanizing rhetoric and demands to kill the wicked rebels. Whether a chosen strategy or due to genuine religious convictions, or most likely both reasons, it contrasted sharply with parliamentarian thundering rhetoric about God's battle and execution of bloody justice. And then to conclude. The major differences in opinion regarding religion and warfare can be summed up in a few points. First, parliamentarians justified their resistance with religion, and they did not see any problem instructing and encouraging soldiers for better performance on the battlefield. It was, after all, God's war in which his saints had to participate. Royalists, for their part, criticized the use of religion to educate soldiers in martial matters and rather used their spiritual prestige to achieve a moral reformation among the king's armies, especially concerning swearing. Second, the content of more religious counsel was markedly different between the sides. While royalist ministers wrote long prayers for their soldiers' use and emphasized that praying was the only way to end the conflict by appeasing God's wrath, parliamentarians instructed to actively seeking the goals one prayed for and straight up criticized passive supplications. The king's ministers stressed that one should submit to God's punishments for the nation's sins, whereas Puritans attempted to make a change through their vigorous action. And third, rhetoric that the parties used to present and disseminate their opinions were quite distinct, especially when it came to describing the enemy. While parliamentarians did not hesitate to use very harsh language of royalists, dehumanizing them and even giving Puritan soldiers religious justification and command for killing them, the king's ministers condemned the uprising but emphasized that those participating in it were not beyond redemption as long as they just ceased their resistance and asked for forgiveness. Last, the audiences to whom royalist and parliamentarian ministers directed their attention to were markedly different. The former, royalist, reached out to the population at large, and especially to those fighting against the king, seeking to make them change sides. The latter chose to talk strictly to their own supporters in order to strengthen their resolve, encourage them, and facilitate more effective pursuit of warfare. These distinct strategies, in addition to religious convictions, shaped the use of religion as a tool for war during the 1640s in England.